Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Paul Gray, the Secretary Treasurer of the Schooner Association. Peter Thompson is with me, and we'll be doing the actual presentation tonight. I want to thank everybody for joining us for our inaugural Third Thursday webinar series. We're going to be doing these every third Thursday of the month. And the idea is really just to come up with different topics about schooner-related things and present them out to membership and anybody else who may care to join us. It's not restricted to members, so anybody is more than welcome to join us. As I mentioned, Peter will be doing a presentation tonight on the restoration of Blackbird, which is in Alden 309, as well as some very interesting information about the 309 itself. Peter had given this presentation at our annual meeting last year, Peter, I think it was? Yeah, last year. And it was a very fascinating meeting. So when we decided to do this, I reached out to Peter to see if he'd be interested. And he very graciously jumped into the fray. So with that, couple of things. The presentation itself will take about 45 minutes. We'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So at that point, we'll unmute everybody because I think everybody is muted at the moment. We'll unmute everybody so that you can talk and ask questions of Peter, and we'll see how that goes. And I think with that, we're all set. And Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I'm going to share my screen, and I just want to verify that the screen is being shared and people can see it. Is that working?
Yep, I got it, Peter.
Okay, so I'm going to assume that we have liftoff. Thank you, Paul, for the introduction. Tonight's talk, as Paul has indicated, will be around the 309 schooners. Part of it's about the restoration of Blackbird, but there's some other topics I want to cover because they're interesting. Let me see. It's not advancing. There we go. It's advancing now. So the topics I want to talk about tonight are varied. Important one is when you're doing a restoration like this, it's all about the help along the way. You can't do a restoration by yourself. You know, when you're doing an owner restoration, you're typically working like myself full-time. So you're only generating one full man-hour of work on the boat every 2 years. Compared to a yard, it might have 5 employees, and they're doing 10 years of man-years of work in 2 years. So help along the way is very important. The really interesting topics, I think, are the naval architects of the time, design of the boat. We have a big archive of information on the yachting business in the Depression. We'll talk about that. There's some very interesting stuff there. And then finally, we'll get into the methods, materials, and what I call the madness, which is restoration. But all talk should start with a disclaimer, and here's mine. And this disclaimer comes from Jim Lobdell of Malabar, too, if some of you know him. But he has always said that I'm one of the few people that can talk a dog off a meat truck. I don't know whether that's a compliment or whether it's just what it is, but it's probably pretty important tonight because we have to go through 185 slides. So I want to start also with some acknowledgments to do a project like this, and this is for those who may be inspired to do a restoration project on their own. You need to have a good support team. Clearly, my acknowledgments go to my wife, Sandy, and Tiller Dog, who really were movers in the project, but most importantly, Bobby Pulsch. Bobby Pulsch is no longer with us, but he has built many boats. And he said to me on a visit, Peter, if you're going to complete this project, you have to touch the boat every day. And what that meant was you didn't have to work on it every day, but you at least always had to go sit on it every day and touch it. You may be just having a beer and thinking about work and planning things, but if you don't touch the boat every day, the boat will get away from you. And before you know it, months have gone by and nothing's gotten done. Then also reach out into the community of the yacht designers and builders and find help. Niels Hellenberg, also no longer with us, was the last naval architect of the Alden firm and later Hellenberg Designs. And he would add little tiny little bits of thoughts and ideas, small ideas, which would be large in their implications in terms of improving the project. Joe and Jamie Lowell, we used them on some specific aspects of the project for help, building garbards and cockpits. Frank Luke is a huge problem solver. He did a lot of our fab work, but I could call and talk to Frank and say, I've got this issue, got this problem, and what are your thoughts? And he'd come back the next day with a very simple, elegant solution that would work and save a lot of money and be just what we needed. Matt Sear did a lot of our fab work as well, did great work. Ross Gannon, everyone probably knows Ross. He's just a source of encouragement, a well of ideas and a well of knowledge. And he spent some time here helping us think about how to bend in the big Angelique garbards, but most importantly, just the encouragement of getting the boat done. Have a good surveyor on your project. We had Cap Leonard and Paul Haley. They're important to make sure that what you're doing is correct. Doug Theobalds is our go-to varnish and paint guy. He has worked with us for over 30 years, and it's the paints and the varnishes that help protect the vessel. And then underlying all of that is Alan Dugas at Royal River Boatyard, who's just been a great boatyard, always ready to help with the boat and appreciates and understands what it is to take care of a wooden boat. So let's talk a little bit about the Alden schooners themselves. Golden Hind and Twilight were probably the predecessor boats to the 309 design. Golden Hind had a beautiful lofty staysail rig. Twilight was designed the same year as the 309s, and she also had a very similar lofty rig. Here is the design plan from Augie Nielsen for the 309 sail plan. Very similar in stature to the previous sail plans we've just shown. But the amazing thing to me is, I just can't get over this. Augie Nielsen was only 21 years old when he drew the plans for the 309. He was an absolutely brilliant naval architect. Augie came to Alden from Denmark. He was a Danish yacht designer. He had put a plan into Rudder magazine in 1925. Alden saw it, and Alden called him up and hired him. Later, when he worked for Sparkman Stevens before the war, after which he started his own firm, like many people did, Alden was so impressed with Augie. He said, basically, even though I was the top dog, I was well aware that Augie's knowledge and experience were far greater than my own. What an accolade from one of our greatest yacht designers. Augie Nielsen was clearly way ahead of his time. So if we look at the Augie Nielsen sail plan for the 309, he also produced a gaff on gaff. Only 3 boats ultimately were ordered with this sail plan. But it speaks to the question, why are we having multiple sail plans? Well, the 309 design was a unique idea to Alden at the time to produce a large serial schooner, large being large in our time, small in that day, 43 feet on deck, in a serial fashion. What that meant was that they weren't having people coming in and doing a one-off knockout design for a boat, but they offered a design with 2 sail plans with a headsail rigs that included single and double headsail, so really 4 sail plans, and then 3 accommodation plans. And the idea was that a prospective buyer would come in and order a sail plan, an accommodation plan, and then the boat was already halfway built by Gowdy Stevens, because all the 309s were built by Gowdy Stevens by contract, and the boat could be delivered very quickly and very economically. To give an underscore to that, Alden had a very mature firm by that point in time. He had a brokerage business that was very well developed, led by Robinson, John Robinson. He had a marine insurance business, and he had the marine architecture business. Here's a cut sheet from 309F. After the first 5 309s were sold, Alden realized these boats were going to be so popular that he started building them on spec, and I mean speculation. So he was building boats and without owners. And then he put a sales force together to market the Alden brand. And here's one of the documents we have in our archives from that. And they identified that these schooners were really very well established and sailed well to windward and much better than actually some of the full keel versions of the time. And the slip sheet went on to talk about the attributes of the 309: stiff, church-like stiffness, stable, fast, seaworthy, easy to handle, which I'll vouch for. Just my wife and I is all we need to sail a boat. Can't capsize it, that's a big selling point, but a lot more boat inside. So you can see that the Alden brokerage firm was really well developed, well organized, and they were selling the Alden brand. And here's the construction plan that Augie drew, again, age 21, brilliant guy. And you can see some of the attributes that led to the boat's features. Here we have the beam section highlighted, and you'll see that there's a very sharp turn to the bilge midships and a very shallow ballast keel. And this leads to a very good righting moment where the boat ends up being very stable. It's hard to get the boat to heel over much past the point where the rail is just getting close to the water. Also in the Augie plan, we see that the mainmast is very far forward. It's right behind the centerboard trunk, highlighted in yellow. In contrast, we'll take a look at a later plan. This is Blackbird's. Blackbird was the only custom 309. She did not have a stock interior plan. She did not have the stock sail plan. Her sail plan was done by Carl Wahlberg, and the accommodation plan had to accommodate that. But they were very, very commodious boats for family cruising. That's what they were designed for. Nice cabinetry, 3 big berths in Blackbird in the main salon, plus a hanging berth, which is great for overnight sailing in rough seas for crew. And then we have a large stateroom, galley forward, and head to starboard. So down below, the boat has a lot of room, and they were great family cruising boats and ended up becoming family legends. If we look at the Carl Wahlberg version of the boat, we see now that the mainmast is back a good 18 to 24 inches farther aft than the Augie Nielsen sail plan. If we look at the Carl Wahlberg sail plan, which is what Blackbird is, you'll note that the mainsail is really a lot smaller and the foresail much bigger compared to the Nielsen plan, where we have a very large mainsail reminiscent of Twilight and earlier vessels, and the Carl Wahlberg plan is shorter and stouter. I think what this was intended to do was to create a vessel that was not controlled as much by that big mainsail, and it is. The big mainsail will drive the boat to wind, and but have more power in a foresail. Both rigs have the same sail area, and here they are in real life. There's Blackbird on the left in 2017, and then there's the Augie Nielsen sail plan on 309A, the first 309 owned by Charles Lauder at the time. So let's talk a little about Carl Wahlberg, because he's obviously important in the boat. He was a Swedish yacht designer. He moved to Lynn, Mass, worked for General Dynamics as a rigger, then George Lawley as a spar builder, and then hired by Alden. During the war, he worked for the Navy at the Charleston Yard, excuse me, then started his own firm after the war. He was really well known at Alden for the Coastwise Cruiser, a beautiful boat pictured to the left, Malabar Junior, many others. But he also embraced the age of fiberglass boat construction after the war. And there's a listing on the bottom there of many of his designs: Bristol's, Allberg's, Cape Dory's, Pearson's, all well known. Over 10,000 boats were built to Carl Wahlberg's designs, which is just a huge number. That's why we see so many on the water today. So my little break here, I'm gonna have a beverage. I want to talk a little bit about the 1930s, the Great Depression, and the boat building industry. At that time, you know, there were people like Charles Lauder who bought 309A who thought he could get a deal on a boat. But in reality, the people with money still had money. And the boat brokers were doing a really brisk business in the Great Depression. Here's a long letter from John Robinson to Lauder in April 3rd, 1930, talking about why they were building the boats in Maine, because the Alden group is trying to sell the Alden products. So he notes that boat builders are underpaid and that compared to house builders. And although he thinks this is unfair, he also notes that in the larger yards near the cities, the workers, the boat builders, get paid better wages. But the cost of the finished product, the cost of the yacht from the bigger yards, City Island, down near Massachusetts, you have Dion's Yard, were higher in proportion to the boats built in Maine compared to the wages. And that was the reason why Alden was building boats in Maine. Not because they preferred it, because it made financial sense. In fact, when you think about it, they had to travel all the way up to Maine to inspect the boats and work with the yards on Route 1, driving in Model A's, Model T's, and maybe a Pierce Arrow if they were wealthy. But, it was a long, long truck to get to Maine, and it was difficult, but that's where they built their boats, even though they didn't prefer it. In contrast, let's take a look at what was going on in Olin Stevens. Olin, was the big competitor of Alden at the times. They were always good friends, but they always competed very, very strongly. And here we have a letter on the left of Drake Sparkman in 1929. He's writing to the same guy that John Robinson was writing to about boats. And you can see that Drake Sparkman's letter is very stark, very brief. He doesn't even sign it. His secretary signs it. And then later in 1930, now Drake Sparkman and Olin Stevens have combined and formed Sparkman Stevens. And the overtures to the potential buyers are getting stronger and better very quickly with a new firm. And in fact, the broker is offering to come to Lauder's office. But note that they're not offering to give Lauder any more listings because, in fact, Lauder was not sending them back as he was supposed to, which is why we have such a huge collection of them. If we look at the history of Blackbird, and we're lucky we have a very, very, very good history of the boat. I had conversations with the first owner's son, Charles Arms, when he was in his 90s. And so Myron Arms, the boat was delivered to and built for, lived in Marion, Mass. Their family had a steel mill in Youngstown, Ohio. That was a source of their wealth. In 1930, they ordered the boat, not because they were sailors, but because Myron Arms wanted to teach his kids and his grandchildren to become yachtsmen. In that, he succeeded. But within the first year, after receiving the boat, they had to sell it, and there's a listing on the right-hand side. The boat was delivered in Marion, Mass. It was delivered with an Alden captain, Jesse Brewer, and this cabin boy, Edgar. And the boat was then commissioned on the mooring by Mrs. Arms with a bottle of bootleg whiskey that was provided by the local bootlegger who owned the boatyard in the harbor, who still is there today. And then the boat was sold that year to Arthur Versier. He must have fallen on hard times because the Hubert Topin family bought the boat in 1935 with the yard bills for no more than $6,000. And we know both the descendants of the Arms, Topin family, and also later on down the line, the Charles and Eve Hamlet family. So these have really been family boats. So these boats are all about families. And here's a picture of Ben, Robin, Tim, and Abby Shields. Robin is the great-great-granddaughter of the original owner, Myron Arms. And so we went down to Marion and took them sailing as well with the descendants of the Topin family. Now, everybody loves to have a picture of their boat in a magazine, like Yachting Magazine. And believe me, we were absolutely thrilled to see a picture of Blackbird in yachting. And here she is in the lower right-hand corner, pounding at the pier of the Essex Yacht Club, right in the middle of the 1938 hurricane, the Great Hurricane New England. Outside of her is Typhoon, who has already sunk. And the next day, there's Blackbird underneath a T-dock, several hundred feet down the wharf, with Typhoon, again, still sunk outside her. We purchased the boat in 1993, got married on board. On top of the wheelhouse is my grandmother. She beat me in golf at age 97, off the men's tees. And she lived to 110, and she just thought this whole affair was grand. We sailed the boat for the next 10 years and really fell in love with the boat as well as much falling in love more with each other. So In 2001 in August, we brought Blackbird home after the 2000-2001 season. We needed to put the centerboard in. It was never in the boat, and the horn timber and the rudder post was leaking. So let the madness begin. Here's the part of the talk that really is engaged with the restoration. And at the end of the talk, if you have questions, or after the talk, you can certainly communicate with me and get into more detail. So the objectives, really very simple. Put in a centerboard, replace the keel timber because that had to be done, replace or repair the stern post, and the boat's going to be back in, a couple of years. So we built a temporary boat shed, something for a couple of years. It worked well in the wintertime in Maine. We have a lot of snow up here. In this picture, you see the keel timber sitting out in the backyard in the snow. And this is the scope that I told Sandy: frames, floor timbers, stern post, ballast, keel bolts, garboards, and a fairly easy sequence of activities to accomplish that. Well, you know the story. The list grows, and this is how it ended up. This is just a list of things we had to do. I could not possibly reconstruct the sequence of how I made it happen. But these projects grow. That's what I expected. People are often interested in how you plan the materials for projects like this. So I put this slide up there to sort of give some insights. Recognizing this boat was done with a limited crew, myself, my wife, and tiller dog. So it took a year, 2 years to create 1 man year of labor. And that's what this sequence reflects. For yards or projects where you're hiring lots of people and you get 10 years, man years of labor in 2 years, it's going to look different. But basically, oak is easy to get. We got most of our oak locally. Big timbers, Connecticut naval ship timbers in Connecticut. Unbelievable, the oak that they have just lying around. 50-foot keel timbers all over the place. Big planks. Angelique, we got all that wood from Ross Gannon at Gannon and Benjamin, previously Brad Ives. And we use all of those in keels, garboards, centerboards, trunks, things that were exposed to the water because it's very shipworm resistant and it's very stable. The rudder we soaked in linseed oil for 2 years and kept it damp, and it hasn't checked. Ross said it would probably check. It hasn't because of that treatment. And if it checked, it wouldn't be a big deal anyway. Viking Lumber up in Belfast, Maine, they were fantastic. We wanted white pine for the decks. It took them 6 months to find a big old growth type white pine stump. And they did. And they called me up and said, we have the wood, let's cut it. And we did. 2 years to air dry. Long leaf's easy. And this was mostly for interior work, not for planking. Catamount sawmill. And then, of course, bronze fittings, Frank Luke, Cumberland Ironworks, and bolts, Paul Luke as well, Frank Luke. And those are pretty easy to get on the schedule. So when we start talking about the restoration, we're lucky with Blackbird. All the original interior was pretty much there, somewhat beat up in places, but all there. So the first step is to remove and categorize the interior. Then remove the ceiling plankings to see what you got. What kind of boat did you buy? And here we have the starboard side interior. And we see up in the upper right-hand corner, upper corner here, the red box. That's a backing block on a chain plate. Doesn't look very good. A lot of rust staining below. Down here underneath the hanging knee is a broken frame, the only broken frame in the boat, which is amazing considering Concordias will have at least 20 to 30% of their frames broken in half the time. And this boat went through the 38 hurricane. So very stoutly built. Then there's the hanging knee. So because our planking was in really good shape and the iron fasteners didn't seem to bother the long leaf, we decided to keep the original planking intact to the extent we could, which was about 95%. So we cut the frames out from the inside and drove the fasteners outward and then marked all the frame locations so the new frames could go back in the exact spot and refastened through the same holes so we didn't Swiss cheese the planks. Here's a picture of what that looks like. Half the frames are replaced, half the frames have just been removed. And they're laminated frames so we can tuck them underneath the bilge stringers. We can tuck them underneath the clamps. And this is a great repair technique, by the way, if you have a couple frames that have to come out and don't want to tear the boat apart. But the key thing about resourcinol is that you have to get to cure properly, which means it has to have temperatures above 70. And you have to have enough glue, you can't starve the joint, but it's easy to do. Really nice glue. And all along the process, you'll find interesting things, and these are some of the neat ones. Upper left-hand corner of the red box, there's a fragment of the shear plank from the 1938 hurricane. So we have the 1938 paint job and cove stripe and some Essex River mud. Down below, this arrow connects two ends of a bolt. That bolt was actually the bolt that held our stern post together. So you can see the extent of deterioration of some of the structural fasteners after 70 years, but yet we were still very comfortably sailing this boat in 30, 40 knot days with 10, 15 foot seas at worst, mostly 6 and 7, and never worry not knowing what the bolts looked like. But the coolest thing was the choo-choo train that we found, and that was on a butt block in the main salon or in the owner's stateroom. Clearly built at Gowdy Stevens, lost by some child. Cutest little thing. So we talked about things you can't see when you are surveying a boat, and here are those chain plates I pointed out earlier. And you'll see the extreme deterioration on the bottom chain plate, yet we were merrily sailing along all the time with these chain plates, and they never failed, and they were stressed. So it's amazing the residual strength of the wrought iron compared to modern day materials like stainless steel, which would probably have snapped. So as we get moving on the boat project, the next step, once the framing is done, is to remove the ballast. And we decided to construct a cradle to retain the boat's shape and bear the weight of the boat so that the boat didn't have to bear the weight of the iron ballast. And here you see removing the ballast. You see a big lead sledgehammer. It's a 50-pound lead sledge, greatest thing ever invented by man for removing keel bolts. Slide the ballast aside. These are rollers that we borrowed from Alden over at Rural River Boat. He let us keep them for about 7 years. When he needed them, we'd borrow them back and give them back. Worked out very well. And simply slide that big 4-ton iron ballast by yourself all the way out to the side, and then pull out the keel timber, which you see coming out, turn the rollers upside down, and out comes the keel timber. Next step, a good old friend of mine, Steve Mitchell, when I went down to Calumet Mill and got a big piece of Angelique, he thought that was the greatest thing in the world, providing a boat trailer with a piece of wood like that. Bring it back, and you know, when you're working alone, handling a big piece of wood like that is difficult, and you learn how to do it. Luckily, my wife owned her own fork truck, and if I was nice to her, and if I promised to put the fork truck back where I found it, she let me use it. And that was a very handy tool for managing those large timbers. And the timber itself was just a fun process, get the chainsaw out and then start slicing it up. The little time, we have a new keel timber laid out next to the old keel timber. And I'm gonna try to start what they have as a tool called a laser pointer. And I want to point out that if you look along the edge of the old keel timber, there are frame pockets. And along the edge of the frame pockets, the timbers are all very seriously checked and deteriorated. The frame pockets are a convenience for building. They actually hurt the longevity of the timber, so we did not repocket our frames. If you look at Brilliant, reach underneath by her keel timber, her frames are not pocketed. Ross Gannon advised against it. So we didn't pocket the frames. That's one of the deviations against the original construction approaches, but that's okay, because our objective was to rebuild Blackbird identical to the original 309, so that construction methodology would be preserved forever, and we've succeeded mostly in that. Here we see on the right, we see that the centerboard trunk attachments have been essentially just replicated. You know, there's a lot of parts on boat construction projects that people feel they're not comfortable with, such as doing a garboard rabbet, but it's really easy. You put the plank up, the keel timber back to the boat, and you simply envision what the plank is going to look like, And then you measure the angles at each station and transfer those angles on a board to the timber, and then cut those angles into the timber and then connect them by planing with a rabbet plane. Well, an experienced boat builder would simply use a skill saw, but someone like myself, we took a slower path, but it didn't result in any errors. And here's the garboard plank twisted into place. You can see it has a lot of twist. Anybody who's worked with Angelique knows how stiff it is, and it's a lot of energy to twist an Angelique plank like that. One of the great tools that I learned from Bobby Pulsch was what we call the Bobby box. Others have used it, just a horizontal drill box. Make a box, put a drill in on a slide, but it allows you to drill very, very accurate long boreholes. It's kind of like a take-along drill press. And here's the centerboard. In this slide back here, we're drilling the centerboard sides. Here's the centerboard sides all drilled, and we're reassembling the centerboard trunk on the keel timber before it goes in, just so we know that it's going to work. And the way you keep the water out of a structure like this is splines. And the splines are run all the way down the length of the plank. And in this picture, these are pine splines just for holding it together. The final splines were Angelique. We swelled them and carefully measured them so we knew how much to undercut them. So here's the centerboard, the centerboard trunk being built. Keel timbers under the boat now. The spline goes in the location on the left that I just highlighted, and you will note that all of the boreholes are just outside the edge of the spline very consistently. Build the sides of the centerboard up. The original board was drifted. We didn't drift it. We put it in with bolts. And then when you get up to the final construction height, the bronze bolts go down through about 4-foot long bolts and out the bottom of the boat, and you connect them. Here that we bed everything in white lead. That's the way the original trunk was done, in white lead, and we didn't deviate from that. And the result has been a trunk that has not leaked a drop in 5 years. As it comes down to fitting the next step of the project, and there's a lot of parts and pieces, we left the original floors in until the keel timber was in. So now we could determine the keel timber was in the right location. And then we could determine where we wanted to have the cabin sole line, which we put about an inch below the original, because 70 years older, we're a little taller. An extra little headroom doesn't hurt. So with time, you start building and putting all the floor timbers in, patterning the floor timbers and carefully putting them in. You'll note that you'll start seeing white spaces between planks. Some of these are so large that you could drop a number 2 pencil right through, and you'll wonder how you're going to caulk that, but we'll show you. It really is not a problem for a big boat to reswell it in place. So here we are, all of the floors are cut, nothing's attached, and now is the process of fastening the floors in, using jigs to drill the holes, and alternating between bolts and drifts. On the left side is a drift, on the right side in that floor is a bolt. Here's how we do drifts. If you haven't done drifts before, they're great, they're easy. Take a piece of round rod, you peen the end over so it fits over a washer. And another trick from the Lowell brothers, put these big, gnarly, nasty barbs in it. That drift will never come out. So here we are now to the next part of the problem that we had, and that was the old stern post. And here you can see a leak, a crack right through the entire timber. So we simply built a new timber out of Angelique, patterned after the original, and put it in. Here's a neat trick. Pay attention. You've got to attach this big timber to the existing timbers, but boy, you don't want to drill a bolt hole that's 5 feet long to do that. So we put a pocket bolt in. Another Jamie Lowell trick. 2-inch diameter bronze shaft. We drill a hole through it and tap it. And then we stuff that into a hole that we've drilled perpendicular, absolutely perpendicular to the bolt that we intend to put through it. And that sounds difficult, but it's really not. You just make a jig to drill all that. So now that bolt is going to go through the bronze rod, And it's basically just a big nut, and you put a slot in the end so you can turn it and to align it. And boom, before you know it, you've got the pocket boat installed. Moving forward in the boat, we did redo the stem, and we put all the nice new stainless steel floor timbers in that were made by Frank Luke. We didn't pattern them individually. I gave him the old galvanized ones, and I probably should have been a little bit more careful because some of those got bent coming out, but they all went in okay. And then you had to chink the iron ballast, polish the iron ballast and prime it, paint it, and then drill out only one, luckily, old broken keel bolt that was an iron one. And this is how you drill out a keel bolt. You don't stand there next to the drill and drill it, because the drill will fetch up and throw you onto the ground. If you sit on the drill, you put the weight on it, and then when it does fetch, it'll spin underneath you. It's much safer, but it took 2 days in this position to accomplish that. And then when the holes are all drilled out and you're exhausted, the keel bolts won't fit through because they're not totally fair. And I called Frank Luke up. Again, remember, you gotta have a good support team. I said, Frank, you know some of the big boring bar or something? He goes, well, let me think about that. He calls up the next day, says, Peter, go down to Napa and get a brake hone. Put a brake hone onto a drill on a stand and just let the brake hone do the work. Sure enough, $25 of parts, all the holes honed beautifully, accepted all the keel bolts lovely. So very simple solutions. You got to have a good network of people to talk to. So we also had to grind the iron ballast down because it wasn't flat, and that was a long, laborious task. But we ended up with a very, very flat contact between the keel timber and the ballast, which means we didn't bend the centerboard trunk by tightening the bolts. And this little potato chip at the end you see hanging out, that's a 7-foot lead wedge to make up the difference. You can see how much deflection there was in the ballast. It wasn't hogged, it was the way it was made. So then you have to determine a gasket material between the gasket of your iron ballast and the keel timber. We looked and did a lot of research, didn't like tars and things like that that we could find. They weren't as good as the old days. And so we arrived at 5,200. And the neat thing about 5,200 is people always tell you if you want something to come apart, don't use 5,200. And we really probably didn't even need the keel bolts because we decided to use 5,200. But that's kind of a false narrative, because in reality what we did is we waxed the opposing surfaces of that iron ballast and the keel timber. And this is a trick again from the Lowells where they make custom gaskets. And that 5,200 will now become a gasket. You'll be able to remove that 5,200 gasket 30 years from now when you separate the iron ballast to replace your keel bolts, hopefully. But here we are, a husband and wife deal, 2 people, put the big ugly iron ballast under the boat, get it positioned, drill all the holes in, and by cocktail hour, we have all the bolts in. Again, another little fine point from Niels Hellenberg. He saw photographs of my keel bolts with the Aquamet nuts, and he said, Peter, what are you doing? Cannot do that. You cannot do that. I said, why, Niels? He said, it will gall. I said, what's galling? He said, you will tighten the nut and it will weld to the similar metal and you will never get it tight. Use bronze. So again, we talk to the naval architects, small ideas that make big, important differences. Another lesson learned. So there's the finished ballast. Next day, remove the deck. And this is where Halyard and Sandy really did a lot of work getting rid of the deck. We were lucky that we, on the left, decided to mark all of the deck planks, and that helped us to figure out all of the tapers later on. Here are all the deck beams. Keep them? No, of course not. They're a mess. Get rid of them. Easy decision. Put new ones in. You see the frames forward, not yet done, but new deck beams are going in anyway. So here's the foredeck being framed and the weather decks. Here's the cockpit being framed. And now we can start putting on the new deck. This is a white pine vertical grain deck, exact to the original. It's lightweight, it's painted, it's cool, doesn't add much weight to the boat. And the actual total lumber cost was less than $2,500 for the entire deck. Compare that to teak. So the deck is moving along, looks good. Sandy's protecting the forward part because she's doing all the caulking, and she's working away, caulking everything. She took my caulking irons away. I'm no longer allowed to use them. And she frowns every time I ask for them. But the next step was to get the ceilings in, and you're working constantly to get other parts done like the floors. Finally, we decided to move the boat into an indoor location that winter. And here's the boat being out of the shed. First time we've seen it outside in over 10, 12 years, and it looked like hell compared to what it looked like when it first went in, but we knew we were making progress. Bucky, our boat hauler, is the best. He'll slide the boat in anywhere without even slowing down. He had about an inch of clearance on either side and just slid her right into the even keel boat shed. Now we're inside, we can work in a protected environment. We can keep the dog hair out of the seams. Everything gets taped, the seams get paid, and all of a sudden you just pull the seams and you start seeing the boat looking like a boat. It's starting to move forward. And these are sort of the moments that sort of juice you up and you go, we're getting somewhere. So next step is a cockpit. We removed the original cockpit. Sandy said, how are we going to build a new one? Can we reuse the old one? I said, no, it'll be easy. So this is the cockpit in 10 easy steps. First, you remove the cockpit, then you remove the deck. Next thing you do is you replace the deck, and after that, you build a mold. And on that mold, you put on MDX to make it nice and smooth, and you go find and buy yourself a big, big stick of mahogany. And that mahogany, and I hope these slides are moving quickly for you folks, is then going to be turned into veneer. And this gentleman in the Maine woods charged no more than a 12-pack of Bud Light to cut our veneers. I paid him too. He was a little insulted. And once the veneers are sanded, you put them on the mold, some Meranti over the top of the veneer, and then more Meranti, another piece of veneer, and MDX on the outside. And we now have 4 layers of Meranti and 2 layers of veneer, and voila, you have a cockpit. So here's the cockpit blank coming off. Here's the cockpit blank being fitted so we can spile it. Here's the blank being planed and then put on the boat. And Joe will do the final fitting. I was too busy at work, and he's just an artist anyway. So now the boat gets to come home. And the boat looks a lot better after a year from when we just pulled it out of the shed, and the shed is now down. Next step is to do things like rudders and center boards. Here's the center board being laid out. Cut out the lead weight. Pour the lead weight. You can plane it with electric hand plane. Works very well. And then you tell the crew what it is they got to do. Explain things, what's expected, and let the crew get to work. And with a little beneficent neglect, let the crew get the job done. Before you know it, the crew's got the board back to you, and you can start putting in the nice new hardware that Frank Luke had produced for us. Same thing with the rudder, lay out the bolt patterns, and just simply drill it and put it together. Here we are, shaft log has to get done because we have all these new timbers. We got to find a way to put the propeller shaft out, so that's being done. And then again, the bobby box for lining up the rudder boring shaft was a great tool again. It's been used many times in the boat. And there's the bearing for the boring bar. So you'll note here that all the planks are now on, but there's some large mysterious pipes under the boat, and the boat's all tented in. You noted that earlier I said we could drop a number 2 pencil between many planks, which was true. So those pipes are attached to industrial humidifier, 30 pounds of or 30 gallons of water a day as mist, and in 45 to 60 days, the boat's swollen. In the meantime, install the worm gear, the wheel box, do the combings for the cockpit. And the trick on the combings is make the new combings look older and worse than the original ones, and no one will ever suspect that it is not an original cockpit. As things progressed, we tented in the boat, put the industrial humidifier on. Now in Maine, things like an industrial humidifier are pretty grand, and they might be subject to theft. So in that case, we had Tiller Dog guard the boat, and she would go up on a daily basis on her ramp and just make sure that no one fooled around with the boat in our absence. Next was the seam compound party. All the friends can come on over and have fun painting the seams. That's a big job. When that was done, Sandy hired a nice gentleman, a very nice guy, who did the paint work on the transom. It's hard to find guys who can do really good gold leaf anymore. It's not as common, but we did find someone and he did a great job. TJ recarved the scrolls. Bucky came back. We gave him a good oatmeal cookie. He made him very happy. And he put the boat on his truck and brought it back to Alan Dugas's. So here's the boat at Alan's. And Alan's got the boat up in the travel lift. We're putting in the board. And there's the boat getting ready to launch. Looks much better than you just saw just a few slides back. We have yet to hook up the bobstay and things like that, but she's getting pretty close, in good company. The William hand is right behind her underneath her bowsprit. And then with very little fanfare, she's due to go in the water. Now, the week we launched her, Sandy had to go down to help her mom in Florida, and Tiller Dog hadn't made it over the finish line. So it was a pretty lonely day. It was just me and the boat and some friends. But off we went and put her in the water. It was a big moment for Blackbird after all 15 years to finally be back in the water. And really, really, really good feeling for the boat. To be back on a dock again and to be sitting in salt water, soaking up the salt water, getting stronger, letting all those planks swell, letting the boat get hard and tight. That's what it needs to do. And then we hauled the boat that winter, not because we wanted to, but because I had made a mistake. When we put the motor in, I never checked the oil pressure. And I never imagined in my mind that a 65-year-old 4107 would have an oil pressure problem. But the gunky oil did clog the oil release valve. And so for a 15-cent part, we had to pull the motor back out of the boat. So when you recondition a motor, check the oil pressure. So the next year, we finally get to go out, and we're heading down Royal River. We finally get the first chance for a sail in 16 years. Good feeling. And a nice, easy coast and ghosting winds back to the mooring that night. The next year, we took the boat down to Marion, which was a little stronger, took all the arms out and the Topin family out sailing, and go to Gloucester every year. Great family racing event, great for families, great for boats. And you always get some good pictures. Here's a good picture from Albazanton after a near collision. And you'll see the church-like stiffness of the 309. It's hard to get the boat to heel much beyond that in any kind of wind. And so here's the last slide, up in Nova Scotia. I've reached my 45 minutes. And here's the parting thought. For those that are interested in taking on an old boat and restoring it either by paying for it or by doing it themselves, remember one thing. If you're doing it yourself, remember the words of Bobby Pulse. Make sure you touch the boat every day. If you don't, either you or the boat might not make it to the end of the project. So that's my only parting thought. I will take any questions now. And I think at this point in time, I have to hand the presentation back to Paul. Is that correct?
Yes, Peter, thank you very much. That was great. Yeah, I'm going to pull up another short little presentation. I'm just going to unmute everybody so that anybody who has any questions can ask.
Do I have to do anything, Paul?
Nope.
Good.
For some reason, this is taking a little while to actually unmute. I'm not quite sure why.
Peter, fantastic presentation.
Hi, Bill. How are you? Thank you.
Very well. Doing very, very well.
No questions from someone like you?
Oh, no, I got questions.
And just a note, a certain number of questions tonight. Everybody saw Tiller Dog. My email is tillerdog@gmail.com. If anybody has any questions they want to ask or get more details on some methods and the madness, I'm more than happy to help.
So when you were putting the ribs back in, did you actually steam each rib and then
No.
slide them up underneath?
Nope. The ribs, I would take them in a condition where they would be like in a steamable condition, i.e. there had been air. And the night before I'd put them in, I would cut the laminations out of a stock piece of rib. And there were 7 laminations. I'd cut the heel of it at an angle that was complementary to the angle of the boat, right? Changing shape of the hull. And then the other piece would be just the opposite. So in fact, they're not really truly square. They're a little bit trapezoidal, which doesn't affect their strength. But each lamination is now, you just put it in and bend it.
Right.
And the trick is you have to mechanically fasten them. You can look at various publications that show people with sticks from the interior trying to hold a lamination. I just use bronze boat nails. Small bronze boat nails to mechanically hold the frame together until the glue dried. In reality, the amount of bronze in those boat nails is probably less than 2 screws.
Oh, okay.
Right? Very, very few. But you get a beautiful glue joint, the right thickness, not too dry, not too thick, because resorcinol can't be thick, but it can't be starved.
Right.
Glue joint, I've got a scarf in the foremast. It's either Hyde or resorcinol from the 38 Hurricane. The glue joint, 10 feet long, hasn't moved in 70 years, 80 years. So these glues will be better. Don't use epoxy on oak and come apart eventually, especially if it's wet. But
And what was the weight of the lead that you put in your centerboard?
it was only about 80 pounds.
Oh, okay.
Not much, because the engine leak's a little heavier than oak. The original specification was 90 for the oak board. We backed off a little bit. It's just enough to let the board go down slowly. And we just pulled up with a block and tackle. But the resorcinol frames, I did an article on it for a newsletter years ago, are a great way of, if you have repairs you need to do, you can put those in place in small, tight areas.
Very cool. Now that was very impressive. Very, very impressive. I was just down in Cambridge, Maryland with Denise, and I was looking at Mark Falstick's boat.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty beat up, you know. And I think she wants a little too much for it still. But I got to talk to her. And
yeah, it's a great boat.
Yeah.
And send me some pictures. Let's talk. Maybe there's some ways of doing it.
Yeah. On that.
I think most people are unmuted at this point. Again, it's taking me a long time for everybody's microphones to get turned on. I'm not quite sure why. So does anybody else have any questions?
Might be on.
Yep, Peter, it's Nori Brickman. How are you?
Hi, Lori. Good. Good.
The boat looks so beautiful, Peter. What a project. Have you gotten the interior back in her? Unless I zoned out there for a minute, I don't think you talked about reinstalling the interior.
Oh, well. In 2006, when we sailed down to take on the arms, we just had the ceilings, chain locker, and a head, and a rudimentary galley. We've been slowly refurbishing and putting the interior in. When I talked to Paul Haley, he used it in our last survey, he said, Peter, take your time on the interior. Half the boat's value is in the interior. So we have been putting the original interior back in, take it all out and strip it and varnish it and fit it. And because the boat's moved a little bit, it takes a little bit of fitting to get it back in. But we've got the main salon done, got the bar back in, and we're pretty much ready to paint the whole interior. It's just a matter of time because you have to keep up with everything on the outside too.
Sure.
So we're competing with the outside and the inside. But yes, it's going in and it's looking about as nice as it did when it was new.
That's incredible.
There's some pictures.
Peter, this is Mark Hall in California.
Hi, Mark.
And, just want to say that that's for the 15 years you did it.
Went by pretty quick.
Yeah. Well, I did mine from, out of the water, tearing apart and putting back in 18 months, but I didn't have to rebuild the frames because it's an aluminum boat. But I want to ask if you're familiar with a teragram, which is when Alden schooner was 58 feet. And I sailed on that at the Coast Guard Academy back in the 60s. And
I am not. I do have a list that Niels Hellenberg put together when he was closing down the Alden firm. We worked on it together for a bit. At that time, all the remaining Alden schooners. And the teragram doesn't ring a bell as a vessel that was still surviving at the time, but then again, it might have a different name.
well, it was sold out of the Academy when they went to the One Designs, probably in the early 70s. And whoever bought it did not do the rebuild that you did and try to take it across the Atlantic and sank it. So that's the reason why it may not be on the list.
That's a good reason.
But the lines of it are so similar to yours, and just this looked like just a stretched version of that. And it was the Marconi main and gaff 4.
There was a boat that was actually a stretch version of Blackbird called Two Brothers or Three Brothers, built 3 years later. And I know it's identical because the interior arrangement's identical. The sail plan's identical, but they went from 43 to 45 feet. But then again, a lot of the boats back then do look similar.
Yeah.
How many people can you sleep on your boat, Peter? When the inside's completed?
Well, the main salon, the berth on the port actually is a pull-out berth. You can sweep 2 there. Hanging berth, there's 3 on the port side, 4 or 5 in the main salon if they're really chummy. 2 then, so you can get 7 in easily. And if we still want to put the pipe berth up in the bow, you could probably squeak another. People were drunk enough, you could put them in the cockpit.
Yeah.
But down below, I think 5 is a very comfortable number, but you can stretch it up to 7. Question then, you get so much gear on board, so you're stumbling over everything.
Right. Yep.
Dude, on Quintessence, we get 16 people just in the cockpit.
Well, it's probably because you probably had a keg of beer in there too.
And now about 5 bottles of rum, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that works.
That was after a great Chesapeake-based schooner race. And
So I think one of the things I learned the most of, and this is is that when we put the boat apart, places where we found old bronze fasteners, which weren't lockers, aren't fastened. The ones that were covered in white lead came out new. So if you really want to put the boat together with bronze that's going to last forever, go spend a lot of money on white lead or make some of your own. Great preservative for the fasteners.
All right, if there's no more questions, I wanted to share one more screen, and that is to our next presentation, which we just heard from Mark Hall a moment ago about alluding to the work he's done. So on September 17th, Mark is going to fill us in on the details of that project. So Mark, I'm glad you joined us tonight. This was great. So look forward to next month rather.
Okay, thank you.
Big project, Mark.
So any other questions? We're a couple of minutes past time, but any other questions for Peter before we head out? If anybody is not familiar with the Schooner Association, just hop over to the website, it's amschooner.net, and check us out, because I know there's some folks on here who are not members, and glad to see you're here, but if you want to find out more about us, this is where you can go.
Any chat questions there? I think we're all set.
Oh, that was great. Thank you for doing that.
All right, thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Have a great
you.
evening.
You too.
Be safe and sell fast.
Sail.
All right, good night all.
Good night.
Okay,
all.
good night.
All right.
Good night.
Thank you.